Welcome to Biztech's Technology Show, the show where we feature tech companies and their founders talking about their solutions and how they make a difference. Today, we speak to Professor James Trevelyan, the founder and CEO of Close Comfort. Close Comfort is an Australian, Singaporean-based brand that produces an eco-friendly personal cooling devices that are more energy efficient and therefore have a smaller carbon footprint. James, welcome to the show and thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Now, James, you've got a fascinating background. So before we talk about Close Comfort, tell us about your journey as an academic and an inventor.
Yeah, well, it's a long story. I don't know quite where to begin, but we talked about shearing sheep with robots a little earlier as we were getting started this afternoon.
Yes.
So I guess that's where my journey really got underway, because I had this wonderful opportunity to develop some of the world's most sophisticated and intelligent robots. And we really made Americans and Japanese sit up with some alarm that this technology came from down under. And then after that, my wife persuaded me to have a look at landmine clearance in developing countries like Afghanistan, Cambodia, and so on and so forth. And I said, come on, that's much too difficult for robots. So she got the chief of the Australian Army to twist the other arm. And together they pushed me into minefields. And we developed quite a few pieces of equipment which were used in Afghanistan and helped with demining in Cambodia and several other countries. And then I moved from there into water supply. But my wife was originally from Pakistan, and visiting her family exposed me to the subcontinental heat of summer. Okay. You know, typically 40 to 42 degrees in the bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning if your air conditioner is not working. And of course, with intermittent electricity, well, you lie in bed at that time of the morning and you just pray for the power to come back on so you can get some sleep again while you listen to the mosquitoes lining up for their flight path to get you. And I thought there has to be a better way to keep cool, and it has to run on a battery. So it was just a curiosity project. That's how it started.
Okay, so basically that was the inspiration to start it. So how did you go from pet project to then be an entrepreneur at 65 years old?
Well, good question. So I thought, this is simple. A battery-powered air conditioner, my students should be able to do that. And after a while, I came to this really interesting finding that the students that I was teaching in mechanical engineering who learn about air conditioning were struggling compared to the students who do mechatronics and robotics that don't actually learn about air conditioning in their courses.
Why was that?
Well, I've never fully understood, but I think it is that you have to think laterally to build the kind of machines that we're building. You have to think very differently about cooling and refrigeration compared with conventional approaches to air conditioning. The conventional approach is cool the building and the people will be comfortable.
Yes.
Yeah. So we don't do that. We just cool the people directly and save all that energy so we don't have to cool bricks and concrete. I've yet to meet bricks and concrete that complain when it's too hot. But you got to think differently to do that. And I think that was the trick. So it took ages. It took ages to develop prototypes.
And tell us about the product today and the company today. Where are you at?
Where we're at, we're selling in 4 different countries: Indonesia, Pakistan, Australia, and Singapore. We've sold about nearly 8,000 units. We're expanding our sales year on year by a healthy percentage. And so I've decided that we need a professional entrepreneur to run it. When you start at the age of 70, I tell people I'm a young and inexperienced entrepreneur. So I've hired a professional to do a proper job and make sure the company succeeds from here onwards.
Okay, so and that's I must say that's a very astute thing to do, because not everyone has that toolkit of skill sets that are required to take it forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's very different when you're starting off, and you're facing mainly technical challenges. And, after a while, I realized that I was still doing marketing 101 and I needed a good marketer to get things moving.
Okay.
So I hired a good marketing person, and now I've hired somebody who's got the real experience of running the whole show, doing international trading and retailing, and so on. So I look forward to great things happening. It's terribly important as an entrepreneur to learn to let go as much as it is to get in there and do things.
Okay, and I'm going to tap into your experiences later on in the show, but I want to ask you about your product Cool Focus itself. What's the USP of your product?
Well, essentially, the USP depends on where you are. If you're in Indonesia and Pakistan, where the cost of energy, when you think of all you have to do to get it, particularly in Pakistan where it's intermittent, you have to have a generator, backup batteries, and so on and so forth. Energy is hideously expensive. So the universal appeal of our product is to be cool in the most torrid conditions on just a few cents an hour. And that gets people in straight away. In Australia, it's convenience. Plug it in, you've got cool air anywhere you happen to be. No pipes to worry about. No, you don't have to call a plumber to install it. You don't have to have annual maintenance checks and things like that. Singapore, it seems that health is a big issue. The fact that you've got ventilation, you're not in an enclosed space. So the risk of infections is much reduced. The sick building syndrome is a real issue.
Yes.
When you've got building air conditioning systems. But, using our device, the windows are open, fresh air circulating all the time. It's much healthier.
Within the air conditioning, are they missing out something in terms of combating climate change?
The air conditioning industry does have a big problem, but it is being addressed step by step. So there are two essential issues. The first is that air conditioners use an awful lot of electricity, and the generation of that electricity, particularly in Southeast Asia, requires fossil fuels, and that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, we know that there's a huge amount of effort going into generating energy from renewable and zero emission sources. So eventually that problem will be licked. The other side, of course, is the refrigerant gases themselves. So there was a big political meeting in Rwanda, 2015, and this was developed an extension to the Montreal Treaty, which, of course, you might remember, eliminated refrigerants which harm the ozone layer.
That's right.
And within that framework, the world managed to get an agreement on refrigerants that cause excessive, emissions that are heating the climate. Now, the unfortunate thing is that by itself is not going to be enough. We need other solutions. And when you think about it, air conditioning is still a luxury if you happen to be in India or Pakistan, Bangladesh. And, we know that people there aspire to having air conditioners, just like you might have in Malaysia, we have in Australia. We have to think of more original solutions. And that's where personal air conditioning comes in, because, the impact on the environment is negligible. These are really simple devices. They're cheap. They use very little electricity. They can be run on solar. They can be run on batteries at night. And the refrigerants have no global warming impact at all, because we can use refrigerants which are flammable, natural refrigerants. That's, simple gases like isobutane. And these have a global warming potential roughly the same as CO2 itself. So, and there's tiny, tiny amounts used. So, we look forward to this being a solution which brings air conditioning to the vast majority of the world's population as a necessity, which it will be as the climate heats.
Okay, in this war on climate change, and you have briefly touched on some of the points I'm going to ask you about, what do you see are the low-lying quick wins that less wealthy countries in the region can do to help climate change?
Well, I think the first has to be to address poverty. That's a much more pressing issue. And so another area of my work is to develop means to distribute safe drinking water economically. One of the biggest issues that's impeding social development in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is simply the extraordinary high cost of safe drinking water, typically 20 to 30 times as much as it is in a country like Australia. And it's not that there's a water shortage. This is what I realized from my exposure to this real problem in Pakistan, where we've done a lot of work. The problem is the water distribution systems, which rely on old pipe technology and water meters, which worked fine in the 19th century, but they're not up to the task. in a country like India or Pakistan, Bangladesh, even many developed countries are struggling with water distribution. And so I'm developing technology. You know, it's amazing. Mobile phones, that's a technology which works everywhere.
Yes.
It works just as well in Timbuktu as in New York.
Yes.
And so I started asking myself, what is it about mobile phone technology which has made it so successful? Yeah, sure, there's the technical stuff, but basically the technology works wherever it is, right? You can take your
Yes.
laptop computer and it'll work just as well anyway. But why is it, for example, that electricity distribution and water distribution is such a disaster story in so many developing countries, and yet mobile phones have been such a success? And
Portability is one of the
what,
reasons.
oh, well, you can't carry an electricity distribution system with you. All right, fair enough. It is portable, but ultimately, the system is not portable by itself.
That's
You,
right.
you go away from the towers and you don't get a signal.
Yeah.
So your mobile phone system is just as much tied to the ground as where you are as it is as water supply. Well, the factor that I identified in my research is that the technology, the information technology, is essentially a trust broker. You
Okay.
think about it, a mobile phone system, you've got three major groups of people that all have to trust each other.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, the users. Number two, the corporates that have the money to install the network. Number three is governments, right?
Yes.
Now, in the case of water supply, you've got those three actors. Quite often, of course, the water supply utilities are government owned, but the reality is that the trust is broken down. So people don't pay their water bills because they don't trust the quality of the water. Rightly so, because in many countries, the water supply pipes are full of contaminated, nasty bugs, guaranteed to make you sick.
James, but also it's a financial issue in some of these countries. You can't pay
Exactly.
for the water.
Yes. So, one of my first introductions to life in Pakistan was don't use the phone for long distance phone calls from home. Why? Because the bills are prepared manually in the exchanges, or they were at that time. So you had to go to a public call office where you could see, okay, I'm getting this much time on the telephone. This is what it's going to cost. I trusted those people, right? So the trust had broken down between the users and the providers because there was corruption in the system. But with the mobile phones, the information technology is sufficiently robust to hacking that we don't think when you buy a prepaid SIM card or you put credit on your SIM card, you don't think that somebody else is going to steal that.
That's correct.
Right? So you build up trust. And in the case of water supply systems, that trust doesn't exist. So I said to myself, how do we build a water supply system which has the potential to create that trust? So it's a combination of mobile phone technology and water distribution technology. And that's my long-term goal. After I've done with air conditioners, that's what I want to do. Because I really think that, in developing country, which are, India, Pakistan, their climate footprint's not all that great at the moment. We can do things like personal air conditioning to keep the lid on it. We can install lots of solar panels to provide enough energy. So it's a much smaller challenge in many ways. Climate change is essentially, it's a challenge for countries like the US, China, Japan, and so on and so forth. So I see the big wins in developing countries as tackling poverty. Water supply is one, and there's many others. Even the cost of electricity. We can do a lot to fix that, and a lot has to do, I would say, with engineers. Engineering is taken for granted in so many places, but essentially it consists of two critical aspects. The one is the technology, and the technology works the same everywhere. As I said, water doesn't go uphill any easier in Kuala Lumpur than it does in Perth.
Yes.
But engineering also requires on an amazingly elaborate series of collaborations between the engineers, the people who do the work, with financiers, lawyers, governments, and so on and so forth. All this collaboration is much more difficult in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Even in Malaysia, it's more difficult. Even in China, it's difficult.
Yes.
And that's what raises the cost and impedes development. So a lot of my research has been how do we get around this obstacle?
Now, you also wrote a book called The Making of an Expert Engineer.
Yes.
Tell us about it, and what were your experiences in terms of what prompted you to write it, and what were your experiences, right, going through that process?
Well, you remember I was talking about working in Pakistan on the landmines issue.
Yes.
And we were building equipment, simple tools, and so on and so forth. And I was hiring engineers to do that. And that's what made my hair go gray with frustration. These were smart young people from good engineering schools, but somehow they couldn't produce the kind of results that I could take for granted in Australia, where I'd employed engineers on robot sheep shearing project and others, right? And I was thinking, these are smart people. They've got the technology. What's not working here? And I really couldn't put my finger on it. So I started doing what was essentially sociological research to understand what these engineers were doing, thinking that when I get to Australia, I could compare what they do with what engineers do all around the world. Only to discover that we didn't really have any detailed information on what engineers do anywhere. It was a real startling discovery. I mean, it took years to come to that conclusion. But it seems like the work that engineers do when they're doing engineering, as opposed to, for example, management or teamwork or whatever, it was a mystery. No one had really bothered to write it down. And so in order to answer this question, why were my engineers struggling in India and Pakistan? And by the way, it wasn't just my engineers. I realized it was engineers across the subcontinent and in pretty much every developing country, even China, for example. Engineers really struggle to produce good value for their employers, which is why they get paid a lot less. And anybody can tell you that from the theory of marginal product in economics. So it was a puzzle. And it comes down to this business of collaboration, which of course depends on the local social and cultural issues. So the way people collaborate is very different in Malaysia, from Australia, from India, Pakistan, and so on. And yet in engineering schools, engineers are not even taught about collaboration. In fact, they learn to be individualistic in engineering schools.
Has that changed today?
Not a bit. No, not a bit. So that's why so many young engineers, they come out of engineering school and they wonder what on earth hit them. So that's why I wrote this book, The Making of an Expert Engineer. But it's 600 pages long, and it was intended to do two things. One was to help engineers understand this, and also, of course, to talk about the research which led to it. And so somebody wrote as a review, said there's nothing in this book that couldn't be expressed in 100 pages. Why have you taken 600 pages? Well, I think that was an oversimplification, but I did write a second book, which was out last year, called Learning Engineering Practice, which actually is specifically targeted at young engineers, both in wealthy countries and developing countries, that says, hey, this is really what engineering is all about. You will learn a lot of stuff in this book that you will never learn in an engineering school, and it'll give you a head start in your career. A lot of fun writing it.
So you've gone from academic, inventor, writer, and then entrepreneur. So you've worn various hats throughout your career.
Like this one from Pakistan.
Yeah, I didn't want to be impolite and ask you about that. But what do you think were the key lessons that you learned since you took your entrepreneurial plunge at 65?
Oh, I think there was a key lesson I learned long before that, which was being critical for being an entrepreneur. And that's listening.
Okay.
We tend to take listening for granted. We assume that listening is the same as hearing. But it's not. And somewhere in the middle of my career, I went to a course on conflict resolution, and I learned about active listening. And that's probably been the most valuable thing that I've ever learned. It's a really simple thing to learn, but it's hard work. And now I teach it to my students. I did teach it to my students at the university. I teach it to the people I work with. And that's probably the single most important thing, because ultimately your customers which is what makes an entrepreneur successful, is customers who buy the product. If you don't listen to your customers, then you're going to go in the wrong track.
That's absolutely correct. Can I ask you, James, in terms of what were the key challenges that you faced? You're an inventor, you're a really smart man, you've done different things, but what was the big challenge from taking that idea to commercializing it?
The big challenge was learning marketing, I think. And you see, this product works completely differently to a normal air conditioner. It uses the same technology inside to do the cooling, but the way that you use it is entirely different. So educating our customers, helping our customers understand how to use it effectively and why it's such an advantage over normal traditional air conditioning has been the biggest challenge. So I think for every dollar we spent developing the product, we've probably spent $20 or $30 building up that marketing capacity, education capacity, which is, again, it's all about teaching. We were talking about teaching.
Yes.
And the proof of that is the very high satisfaction that we get from our customers. So the customers who get what the product is all about, they go on the website, they learn what it is, they buy the product, it behaves the way they expect, and it provides them with a good experience. And that's been the same in Pakistan, in Australia, and Indonesia. But of course, there are differences, and there are different messages that we have to get across. So learning that has probably been the hardest lesson. The Australian government, and I'm sure lots of other governments, provide a lot of assistance for research and development in different ways around the world. I've been amazed that there's no assistance for marketing. That's the toughest challenge. And the most interesting thing to me is the lack of capacity amongst marketing companies to explain a brand new concept. I think they've become really lazy. All they do these days is promote brands. So they say, you've got to build your brand. Then we know what to do. Once you've built a brand, we can help you. But, how do you get people to explain a new product? Think about it, Brian. How many radically new consumer products have appeared in the last 20 or 30 years? So the iPhone is probably one example.
Yeah.
All right. There's a few others. But, compared to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when completely new ideas were popping out, every few months. And many advertisers were accused in those days of being really good at persuading people they need something which they didn't really need. You might remember that.
Yeah.
But now they can't do it. All they can do is push brands. And, pushing brands is great. Because look at Haier or Mitsubishi or, all the well-known brands. They've got so many products that it'd be a waste of money to promote them all individually. So, of course, it's simpler just to promote a brand. It's cheaper.
Yes.
But it's a real struggle if you're introducing something radically new, a new concept for people. And so that, to me, is the biggest challenge that we faced. I knew it was going to be a challenge. I didn't know how much of a challenge it was going to be.
And so, James, what's the plan then moving forward for the company?
The plan, of course, is ultimately we want to transform life for people who live in places like the Indian subcontinent and so many other places where people struggle to sleep for months every year. Do you sleep without air conditioning?
Sometimes. I try to if I can.
So, it is a real struggle, particularly once you're used to air conditioning. But now think of the climate in India, Pakistan, and many other parts of the world where the nighttime temperatures hover around 40 degrees, right? You don't sleep. Yeah. So it's not surprising that productivity in countries like India and Pakistan, Bangladesh is so low. It's because people don't sleep for months at a time. So solve that problem, and the kind of transformation that we've seen in Singapore and Malaysia over the last half century, we can make those transformations appear in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as well. And think that what that would do to the world economy. Absolutely. Imagine the prosperity for everybody. And air conditioning is part of that. Lee Kuan Yew points pointed to air conditioning as the key invention which made Singapore possible. The only trouble is, if we use traditional air conditioning like it is now, for the population of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, we'll cook the planet in no time. Right? We have to think of different ways to do it, and that's why I think our technology has got such potential. And of course, it's going to transform life in lots of other countries as well. You know, it just makes air conditioning so convenient. You can have a tin shed and be air conditioned because you don't have to worry about insulating it or sealing the drafts out and things like that. So it just removes all the hassles associated with air conditioning.
Do you have any final parting words of wisdom that you would like to leave us before we end the conversation?
Well, you know, you were talking about inspiring other people to be entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So I think the first thing I would say is that as you age, you get experience. And you know what the research tells you is that, yes, while it's the in thing for young people to be entrepreneurs or be entrepreneurial and learn about being entrepreneurs, their failure rate is appalling.
Yes.
Because they don't have experience. Older people have that experience. And one of the things that I learned teaching is that, for example, that memory improves with age. We all think that your mental capacity decreases with age. What a load of rubbish. You know, unless you get a pathology like Alzheimer's, you know, and that's really, really tough for everybody, not only the patient, but also the families. Unless you get a pathology like that, your memory is improving, but there's a penalty that comes with it. Because your memory's getting better, the amount of junk that you accumulate in your head is increasing exponentially. So the time required to find any bit of that junk, you know, one of those memories gets longer. And that's why people think that their memory's failing.
I see. That's interesting. Something I didn't know.
Any computer scientist will tell you that under those conditions, the retrieval time for optimal storage is going to get longer in proportion to your age. All right? And we don't have optimal storage in our heads, unfortunately. We don't have binary trees and things like that, right?
Yes.
So, of course, retrieval time is a problem. So, you know, the secret to being an entrepreneur is to hire great people. And I've got wonderful people working with me. And, you know, I've got young people. We've got a really diverse team, people who think in different ways. And so, you know, I think the important thing is have a go. And probably the most inspiring talk that I heard was from a fellow called Paul Polak, who was helping the Stanford D School. And he said, don't even think of innovating unless you can make the lives of at least 1 million people better. Number one. Number two, experience their needs firsthand. And number three, make sure you create businesses for the people who distribute your products. That's it.
That's very interesting. And those are lessons I'm going to keep in mind. Thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
Thanks, Brian. Been great being with you.
I'm Brian Fernandez. We've been speaking to Professor James Trevelyan, the founder and CEO of Close Comfort on Biztech's Technology Show. This video will be on our Facebook and LinkedIn sites, as well as our website, www.biztech.asia. Please like and subscribe to our various platforms. Thanks again for tuning in.